But yeah, again, a lot of those marriages they were okay.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think by default it is just better to live with someone. I think you can get something much better. There's been a lot of increased expectations, and in some sense, you also have more selection power. Right? You're not just limited to a very small pool, so you could get all of that thing. You need to do the work of 10 grandmas. Right? Like 2 grandmas were enough to get you like an okay partner for like a medium expectation marriage. To get a great partner for a high expectation marriage, you need 10 grandmas. Making apps or TV show producers, they can do the work of 1 grandma.
Welcome to Moral Mayhem. This week, we're joined by Jacob Falkovich. Jacob writes about dating and relationships currently at Second Person on Substack, but you probably know him from his other blog, Put a Num on It. He's also a great Twitter follow and a friend. So thanks so much for coming on, Jacob.
It is my pleasure. I was really looking forward to this.
Aren't you? I saw something. I don't know where this was, but doesn't he call himself Daddy in some way? I forget.
Epistemic Daddy, I think.
Yeah, my Twitter bio is Epistemic Daddy, which is...
He's also Epistemic Daddy, I guess.
It was originally somewhat of a derogatory term that a rationalist made about Eliezer Yudkowsky. That young women seek Eliezer to be not just high status figure, but they're epistemic daddy. And since I am a father and I care a lot about epistemics, I thought.
So you're ready to step into that role if Eliezer's unable.
Yeah. I feel like
he's the epistemic daddy for normies.
People say I want to be a thought leader. And I'm like, no, I want to be an epistemic patriarch. So I'm gonna work my way up start with daddy.
Start with daddy, move on from there. Okay. So yeah, maybe we can start with a kind of simple question on the surface, which is a lot of people are in more or less functional relationships. But when you look at the dating discourse online, it's extremely negative and extremely pessimistic. So why do people love to complain so much?
Well, I think in particular, it's not just people love to complain, but the things you see on the discourse are people who complain. It's something I've written about quite recently. There's a few reasons for, I call it this negativity bias in discourse. And one is just conflict is drama. Conflict sells. People like stories with drama, with negativity, with something happening. A lot of happy relationship stories, maybe not very interesting. And another thing I noticed is basically there's this famous quote that opens Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, that every happy family is unlike and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And it's completely backwards, and also you'd expect it to be backwards because Tolstoy himself didn't know any happy families. His own marriage was very miserable. And I think the problems in relationships are common, or at least the complaints.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's hard to find someone who matches to you. Once you find someone, maybe you were initially really attracted, you had a crush, you had some expectations, now your expectations aren't met. Maybe there's something about you that you feel is really holding you back from succeeding in dating, and you're just upset at the unjust rules of the game. Or anything like that, even specifically within relationships, how they work, how things happen, right? It's not just happily ever after. Actually, once you're in a relationship, you realize this is where the hard part starts. So when you complain, there's a lot of people who will jump in and amplify you and say, oh yeah, I have the same problem, of course. And if you say, oh yeah, we had this problem, and then my wife and I decided, we can just live with it, or we just solved it, or one of us just decided, I'm just going to step up and take it on myself. No one wants to hear that. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of... It just doesn't go very viral to say that you've overcome this.
How much do you think it's also some converse or the flip side of humility, where I feel like, it's just not as acceptable to be like, fuck, I have an awesome relationship.
Yeah, people hate to hear about good relationships, I feel like, online at least.
Yeah, and maybe it's because of sensitivity to the fact that people know, especially in a context where that other people are struggling to find love or relationships, just to find the countervailing force of positivity is probably hard. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, very much. A lot of the discourse is based on, Scott Alexander calls it toxoplasma, where you have resentment, one side blames another. But then in dating, it's not just men blaming women. It's also, okay, men of one kind blaming men of another kind for breaking the norm and stealing their women. Promiscuous women blaming trad women blaming conservative women. And so if you talk about how your relationship is happy, someone else, this whole Russian joke goes, if you don't have a girlfriend, it means someone has two. And it's a kind of a joke, but a lot of people feel that way, that if you're doing well, it's because in some way you've deprived them. Dating is kind of hard to say, okay, are you actually being deprived, or are you yourself doing something wrong? It's usually fuzzy. And again, it just takes a minority of people who feel that your happiness is in some way depriving them, or you're bragging to put them down and to lower their status. You'll just hear from them. You won't hear from other people who aren't your friends who say, oh, good for you.
But one piece of this that's at least understandable is that, let's say you compare it to something like acquiring wealth or like, doing well in your career, right? That, I mean, at least in a well-functioning like market system, that is truly a more positive sum dimension of life than mate selection. Like if you have a monogamous society with like mostly one-to-one mapping, then it's the Russian adage is like kind of getting at something true. Doesn't mean that that's like the most productive way to analyze it, but It's certainly more zero sum than some other ways, right? Because if you ask like, oh, would you rather be a baron from the 14th century or live as a modern day American poor man, the only place where you would be like tempted to say you'd rather go back to the 13th century is things that are fairly zero sum, and like mate choice is one of them.
Like, I was just listening today to your podcast with Alex Kashuta where you brought up this thought experiment, and I would 100% prefer to be just a regular guy today for mating choice, just because the particular women I am seeking. Okay, let me make the case for positive sum. So
yeah,
you can think of mating markets, like what's your actual challenge here? A lot of people maybe have this view of it. It's basically, dating markets are Chuck E. Cheese. You just need to accumulate a lot of tickets. They're your like attractiveness ticket, your sexual marketplace value. You just get like a big bag of them, and then you go to the prize machine and you fit them in, and it like spits out the girlfriend for you. And if like somebody has like one ticket more, then they like stole your fluffy girlfriend. You get like the one from the bottom shelf. But that's not actually how it works. Because we don't just line up by sexual marketplace value and like everybody, finds out the rank. It's much more of a coordination problem. You could think, okay, there's 1 billion people out there. My challenge is finding the person who's most compatible to me. And my model of it is basically that there are some things that are generally attractive to everyone. For men, being good looking, being tall, being rich. For women, being good looking, skinny, plausibly a virgin, whatever it is. And people do generally, like, people date someone who looks roughly like that, right? Like a 7 is going to date a 7 or 7.5 or 6.5. But then you have all of your idiosyncratic things that they like actually matter. And those things matter much more for the quality of your relationship. Like when you're with someone, you care about how you complement each other, not that they're like slightly more impressive or slightly hotter, right? So you guys are going to marry each other. So you've taken each other off the market. You're actually making it easier. You've now like removed the clutter. It makes it easier for everybody else to find themselves, right? If everybody else matches up, it kind of makes it easier for whoever is left to see what they need. It might seem like a bit of a stretch because there's like so many people, but you have this situation where, especially people in big cities, people on apps, the problem isn't not enough choice for everyone. The problem is too many choice, but it's hard to find the choice for you.
Right. Like it's just a lot of it's just recognizing that you have very different preferences than a lot of other people, and that allows this to be more positive sum. But I just also wanted to flag one thing, which is when you were like 7s will go with 7s. I know that by that you don't just mean purely on physical attractiveness. You mean on sort of like generally understood markers of status and attractiveness, including some other legible signals, right? Like you're just saying like legibly on whatever your legible attractiveness score is, people tend to match up on that.
Yeah, and legibility I think here is important. I usually think of it as what is legible in the first 10 seconds.
Yeah.
Because like if a guy is very loyal, there's also high status, right? Like your friends, if you're dating a guy and that they know he's a cheater, they'll probably think less of you. Like, why are you putting up with this? What's wrong with you? It's not obvious to everyone, right? When you're walking around the street with a guy who's less loyal, Other people have no idea. They don't look at you differently. And so, yeah, it's things that you can tell in 10 seconds. And you can tell quite a lot about the man, not just his looks, but roughly how powerful he is, maybe if he's with friends. Obviously, any markers of wealth in terms of how he dresses. Tell basically which economic class he is, right? Is he like super muscled with tattoos, or is he, skinny and clean shaven? See a guy, you can probably guess he's white collar or blue collar. See, all of that rolls into, and I like to call it sexual marketplace value. Mm-hmm. Although again, it's not quite maybe the appropriate definition. It's a bit people have a lot of negative connotations around terms like that. But I like to reappropriate those terms, to use them for something constructive.
You can see this in real time, right? When you, if you're outside, like people often like observe some couple that like looks ostensibly mismatched, right, on some legible status or looks marker, and usually my facetious response is, he must just have like a massive dick. You just don't know it yet. It's like a less legible thing. But there's something more real there, which is like the earlier you have to select through apps, which have like force you to put the dating app selection mechanism is like the most legible metrics based mechanism. And so as you move towards that side of the spectrum, you'll just get way more selection on legibility, right? And which I guess is kind of why what you're writing is important, because it only becomes a coordination problem that you can solve if everyone recognizes they have like different interests and preferences. But if everyone's preferences are kind of shaped by some common legible theme, as status often tends to have at least one characteristic that is like that, and then you just get bad selection.
A higher percentage on which people are selecting on those like mimetic desires or whatever, right?
Yeah, I mean, the more legible things, the more likely they are to be something that you're attracted to because you've seen other people attracted to it, as opposed to you're attracted to it because, if you're married to someone, you spend tens of thousands of hours together. Actually, your experience is going to be so much better. You're going to be so much happier. In part of this coordination problem of finding someone uniquely compatible, dating apps make it almost impossible, in part because they're just so low context. So almost all the things someone would care about that's very uniquely compatible are things you just need to observe about someone over a long time, right? How do they do under stress? How decisive are they? How kind are they? How graceful they are. So you have no idea. And so in dating apps, different game happening. If you're in Tinder, okay, there's a lot more men than women, and so the game is, women picking who they want to probably sleep with tonight, and then maybe hope to escalate it somewhere. But they're not really solving the coordination problem. It's like women are playing a numbers game because in Tinder they have all the choice, and then they're hoping to luck into someone. And dating apps I think work for women who don't have very strong preferences, and for tall guys. For good looking, that's basically it. Everybody else, right? If you have any sort of preferences about someone, intellectual, spiritual, personality, etc., or if you're a guy who's not very, very legibly attractive, and you're looking for a long-term relationship, you're basically just wasting your time. Having more people under isn't helping you.
Yeah, I think that this goes to the level of agency that people want to put into dating. People want to follow rules and lists and things that are supposed to work for anyone rather than thinking about what is going wrong in their particular situation and changing it. And just why do you think in this area, or do you think this is just generally in every area, are people so anxious to not accept agency and to not try something different?
This is really the main theme of my blog, is why don't people do things? And I think there are really a dozen reasons. And some of them are things that apply to everything. I don't know, people like Zvi, my friend, he writes a lot about how people just don't do things. And maybe some evocative story here is when you start your life, you care about going to school, getting grades. And getting grades, you have a clear kind of marker of what it takes to get there. There's some authority that needs to approve of you. You're not rewarded in any way from being different from anyone else, right? If you just copy exactly what the top student in class is doing, the teacher's pet. You will just get the same outcome as they do. And you want to associate with prestigious people, be friends with the popular kids. Again, if you just basically are like the popular kids are, you'll get what they're getting.
Mm-hmm.
There's no, then it's exclusive. And then you get to dating, and suddenly this weird thing where there's no authority that you can impress enough by following a set of rules. There's no place you can associate with. It's not like, okay, I got into a good college, now I have this aura around me, it's going to take care of me. And you don't really have a script. And in part, like the only scripts you have, right, like sign up to a dating app is kind of a script, right? Like everybody kind of knows how to do it. It's something everybody else can repeat. It doesn't get you far. And then maybe people that are stuck in relationships for a long time where, like, are they exclusive? The relationship isn't really progressing somewhere, people complain. And it's part because, right, the decision to get married, for example, something you've written about a lot, that requires a little bit going off script. There's no one from the outside who will tell you, okay, this is the appropriate time, right? You're not allowed to like live together for more than 2 years. And yeah, I do think that the things very specific to dating also to make people even less agentic. In part, it's easy to fool yourself that you're doing stuff, even though you're not. So whether you're just fruitlessly swiping on apps, and you've been swiping for many years, and you get some like random dates here and there, you might not actually be getting closer to finding the partner you're going to marry in any real way. But you feel, oh, I'm doing something. Or you're like, well, I'm working on myself, I'm improving, I'm getting promotions at work, like getting hotter or something, getting more dateable. I think part of it has to do with people want basically to be dateable, to be soulmateable, to just kind of deserve it. There's a bit of a moral component where if you're just the right person, it should just happen to you. And then if you go out and like try to do stuff and make stuff happen, almost like go against fate, that's just bad. Like the villains are the one with agency. If you did something, you messed up, then it's on you. Whereas if you did nothing, then, well, you just got unlucky that fate didn't smile and you didn't send you a soulmate.
Yeah, I feel like Reg and I were discussing how there's almost at every level, there's like an analog in career stuff, which I write about. And I literally wrote, there's a paragraph where I talk about the same way that you talk about the dating apps psychological satisfaction of matching with like applying for 50 jobs on LinkedIn, right? Like you press apply, you've now checked that box. And I talk to people in my day job who complain that they've applied to like 70 jobs, 80 jobs, right? And in the moment, it's still giving you the psychological satisfaction of like, I've checked off something off my list, but nothing ever comes off of it. And I guess one like additional, maybe this actually just is subsumed in the thing you laid out about basically not liking uncertainty, which is like doing hard things and doing uncertain things. They're actually almost independent dimensions where a lot of people, especially those who are fairly conscientious, they don't mind participating in extremely competitive, legible games because they know what to do. They'll just hunker down, go for it. Right?
Yeah, those things are harder because you're competing with everybody else.
Right. But they don't want to do the thing which is neglected or is just like where you might be able to find a lot of alpha, but like you just don't know if you're on the right path. So I think one thing I want to pose to you, because I think in the career space, it's like kind of easier to answer this question, but in the dating space, how do you know you're making progress? Given like, one problem is like, assume you go to a bunch of parties and stuff, right? This is another domain where you could be like, in jobs, at least, if 50 jobs you've applied to, that's good. Or like 50 matches you got, that's good. But then when you go to sort of a party and you don't meet anyone, you interpret that one binary outcome as like, I'm making zero progress, instead of thinking, well, that's not like, if you just mark that to market, you're not actually making zero progress. It just means you have to try for 4 or 5 times before you get a much more fruitful match. So there's some like non-linearity there, which I think makes it hard for people to kind of stick through it.
Yeah, well, one for careers, I was joking about it in my opening post, is if people talked about jobs, people said, I can't believe my boss is telling me I need to get better at this job. Like, why can't you employ me for who I am inside? And like, on one hand, it's going to look funny when you apply it to jobs. And then you realize some people do apply this to jobs. Like, they talk about economics. as a matter of deserving something. But like, what does this person deserve this job and not that? And say, well, are they doing the job? Like, are they producing the thing? People are like, what? Are they producing the thing? So yeah, measuring progress. Well, the way you measure progress is, in some sense, you meet more and more people who seem closer to your ideal partner that you want to be focused on. One thing this implies, and right, this can mean, if you went on dates with someone and they were like not really compatible, and then, sometime later you go on dates with people who are more compatible, or, you met someone who would have been super compatible, but, she's already taken, but you just become friends. And then, okay, maybe you can talk to her friend, but you're still glad you went to this party because, at least this party actually selects for the sort of people you get along with. You just happen to be taken. To make progress, you really have to have a clear idea of what you're looking for. And then you can tell if you're getting there or not. If you don't have a clear idea of what you're looking for, you just kind of, a lot of people, if you ask them what they're looking for, and they basically just give you like a list of mimetic status markers. This tall, needs to be this rich, needs to like read books. What sort of books? Do you want to talk to him about books? You want to like share book? No, read books, because reading books is like a status marker for.
They want to tell their friends that he reads books.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why you opened with a Tolstoy story, right? So that you'll just be flooded with pings.
Yeah, this is very fun. It's like, I was thinking about, okay, if you like go to someone's house and don't have books, don't fuck them. It's like, okay, specific books. This girl reached out to me because she read my blog, and I flew over to California. I went to her apartment, and the first book I saw on her shelf was The Bell Curve by Charles Murray. And everything else about the girl was huge, super left-wing coded, but also clearly she was like a unique, weird person. And I was like, okay, I don't care what other books are here. This is interesting.
One of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking about the comparison to why would my, employer not just hire me for who I am or whatever, is that even within dating, like as much as people say they want to be valued for who they are deep inside, it's the like, would you still love me if I was a worm thing? And when you start to really investigate this, you do want your partner to think you're smart and attractive and impressive and kind and loyal and all these other things. You don't really want to be with someone who's like, I think you're a piece of shit, but I just love you anyway. I just think it's like, we do want to be objectively desirable. And, you should also want that from the perspective of, if you are going to love and be in this person's life, you want to make their life better, right? So anyway, just
you want to be objectively desirable, but like when people put those lists, and again, kind of my go-to example was a mutual of mine who made this list that went viral about, okay, the guy needs to be this tall, this rich. When you meet the guy, like, are you going to tell him, hey, I really love you because you're tall and rich? That sounds kind of absurd. Like, what people want is, do you love something that's specific about me that matches you, that maybe like wouldn't impress your friends, but you really care about?
Dragon said that to me on the second date, that you like me.
That's right. That's how I got him. Yeah, no, and you want them to love you for the things that you think that you're most proud of about yourself and that you think are differentiators for you. Which I do think is where some women do get upset that they're not valued for their, financial success as much as they would like to be. And if they were a man, they obviously would not want to be valued for their financial success. But because they feel very proud of this and they're in a context where they feel that it's undervalued, they're frustrated by that.
Like, some guys do value women for financial success. Like, some guys are really into that. When I was young and I had my first rich girlfriend, that was incredible. It was a wonderful experience. And, then I dated a girl for 4 years, and she started off pretty broke and then got a job in a hedge fund and relocated to the US. And I was so psyched about it. I was like, this is incredible. I love this. Like, what could be better? And people ask, okay, like, am I weird? I don't know. Like, different guys value it differently. Some guys value it not at all. It's not one of those very legible things, right? Like, putting your income as a woman Hinge probably wouldn't get you more matches. But really proud of your career and you really want a guy who's super into that, you could definitely find guys like that. And if not, then okay. Also, maybe like the sort of guys who really value careers, maybe you're not really into them, right? You're looking for someone And maybe like they're more creative, or maybe they're like very ideological, and they like, pursue making the world better, and so they don't really care how much you make. But when people complain about the stuff, and everything that people say that, oh, I have this thing, and like very few people value it, so that means it's bad for me. Women say that about their intelligence. Well, I'm so smart. So few guys are like as smart as I am. If I'm like 140, 150, so it's so hard. Okay, but I mean, you guys know economics, right? There's supply and demand. Are there more guys who love rich women or rich women? If there are few, more guys who like rich women than there are rich women, then like you're golden. You don't care about everybody else. It's not your dating market.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I think we might want to acknowledge here is the part of this, even if people accept everything you're saying, right, which I certainly do, is there's still a pretty complex search problem here, right, which is why people use apps and things like that. So I actually want to ask you a question on like just the mechanisms to discover these like to incorporate less legible information in your search process, right? So there's two broad categories. So one is just having recommendations or referrals from friends going through social networks. One variation on this is trying to make less legible things more legible, which is dating docs. I want to get your take on like what you think of those two like different types of mechanisms.
So I do very much believe that it's too difficult a problem to do yourself, and any way you can get help. And help doesn't mean friends just matchmaking you. Like help means you find some community, some social circle where you just feel so at home and easy to talk with everyone. Now, it happened to me, 11 years ago when I discovered the rationalist community. And I went from being like the weirdo and the class clown to be like, oh, yeah, people I'm very comfortable with. And right, so like anybody who shows up to a rationalist meetup or anybody who shows up to a party that one of my rationalist friends throws, they're like already selected for so many things I care about in terms of just me being able to talk to them, how they think, how we understand each other, what we value. And so like let the social world do the selection for you. Date me docs, I think it's a very good exercise to write a date me doc and especially focus on what you want and not just what you have, although it's also good to ask yourself, what do I have to offer? Then probably don't show it to anyone because just, I don't know, maybe there's a way to make them better, but you just look at the directories, it's a bunch of guys, it's in a very small community. It kind of starts a bit of a way like with dating apps. The first thing it says about you is, I am single, a little bit desperate, and like doing normal things hasn't worked for me. So now I'm trying this thing that's a bit weirder. And even if it's unfair, that's like maybe if you want to have a date with dog, just send it to your friends if you want them to matchmake you. But kind of putting it out there, I'm not sure that's doing much, but it's a good exercise to go through.
Yeah, and I think like what you were just saying there kind of gets into some of what you talked about in one of your blogs about why people aren't interested in considering how they could change to become more attractive to the person that they're looking for, which is like you are also told, especially women, that it's really important to be confident in yourself and to find someone who loves you for who you are. So yeah, how do you marry those two things? Like how do you suggest somebody go about, being open to changing, but also thinking that they deserve to be treated well and whatever else?
This is weird psyop where like why do we accept that being told that you can improve should make you insecure? It almost be the opposite. Like in the end, reality is gonna smack you in the face, right? Like either the guy proposes to you or breaks up with you. And if he breaks up with you and you're in a mode where like you don't know what you're worth, or your worth is static, and basically he's your barometer, well now he's just proven to you that you're worthless. And you're fucked. So there's nothing to do other than cry. And if your mindset is, okay, I'm grasshopper, just like starting my dating dojo, and I'm gonna work hard and build skills and figure out like what the fuck people value and what they're looking for, then okay, great. Like anything that happens to you, good or bad, is something you can build from. again, so look at this weird signaling. Like, well, if someone is already super awesome, then they basically can get away with strongly signaling, "Oh, don't tell me how to fix myself." And but just aping that doesn't really make you.
They can do that because they're already very attractive to a lot of people, not because it makes them attractive to a lot of people on its own.
Yeah, it's a bit like a broke person, you know, taking a big credit card loan to buy a fancy car.
Right.
That doesn't actually make you successful. It stands in the way to you being successful. And well, what's your goal? To fool someone for a day? You can fool someone for a day. Okay, to fool someone for the lifetime of a marriage? Probably not. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of the reason that people are nervous to give advice on how to improve yourself or how to become more attractive to women in particular is like the idea is that women have always prioritized male relationships and being desirable to men as this incredibly important thing and focus too much time and energy on it already. And so at the margin, you want to discourage that. And I think that is true when it comes to spending time on physical attractiveness, for example. Like, I think a ton of women waste a ton of time trying to get like 5% more attractive to the average man when they're already above the bars of like 90% of the guys they would want to date. But I think like the more general sense of it has gone the opposite. And I was just writing this today where it's like, I know a lot of young women who like, they don't even want to tell a friend about relationship issues because they're going to be told to dump the guy rather than given advice on how to improve the relationship. Because the assumption is you already deserve everything and that you're not doing anything wrong.
yeah, well, there's two sides to it. One is like people not wanting to do things is almost upstream of everything. If you don't want to do things, then of course you don't want to change yourself or fix yourself or develop skills that contribute to being a great wife or husband, because that sounds like a lot of work and also kind of weird and not really rewarded. Whereas just getting hotter, well, at least it's rewarded by status from other women. Then there's the other thing you said, which is, and there's like undercurrent of intersexual competition everywhere. Like, well, I'm miserable, but I want other people to do exactly what I'm doing. Then we're all miserable together. And then it's fine. I don't know. Like, it's like a big black pill. You're growing up as a woman and see all the ways. I've seen somebody, share the piece of research. And like, I'll be like honest here. I think most research in those topics is like kind of useless. But when it confirms my priors, I'm happy to talk about it. I'm not above that. So they did some measure of basically women, how power or status seeking they are, and then like women who were kind of more power hungry or something told other women to get shorter haircuts.
Okay.
Again, like I wouldn't, like I would rely on what you actually observe with women around you more than what you read in a PHAC study. But I don't know, I'm curious how, like my intersexual competition is somewhat different. It's like much more obvious and legible, right? The guys compete to, be richer, be in charge, be more like physically intimidating or something. Whereas for women, maybe, for a while you don't notice it happening and then you notice.
Yeah, I guess like the potential women loving women friendly interpretation of this could be that from the woman's perspective, cutting your hair short signals confidence or something, like in the way that we were talking about before, where it's like it signals that you're able to cut your hair short and still be attractive. And maybe they think that that's like cool or something in other women. Because, this is all counterbalanced by you do get status from other women for being hot in certain circles. And then there's other circles where, the reverse is true to some degree if you're like hot in a conventional way.
Yeah, I think part of the competition is the competition doesn't mean you don't like the other woman. Like you actually like the other woman more. So sympathetic opposition, a friend on Twitter, she wrote this thing about being ladylike. She made the point that if you're clearly doing stuff, and you wrote about it in, why we should shame people who are seeking looks a bit too much. Especially people doing the things that would be very costly for everyone to do, to be a bit hotter, the way it's in like negative stuff, right? Like getting very unpleasant plastic surgery. There is basically a defection against other women. And so if another woman does something that sabotages her dating prospects, but also in the way that she's basically like putting less effort in something, right? Maybe like shorter hair is more easy to maintain. Like other women, I really don't think other women are looking at her as like, oh, look at that loser, we managed to fool her. But like, oh, look at that, she's like a loyal sister. In the sisterhood, we can trust her, right? She's, gonna kind of what's good for the sisterhood instead of like betraying us for a guy.
It signals that you're a girl's girl.
Yeah.
There's also something like interesting about how, like in a liberal society, the one principle or norm we have is this kind of, radical acceptance of sort of difference and choices, right? As long as the locus of the decision is at the individual, we tend to kind of celebrate it and at least accept it and not kind of try to push back. And it's interesting because I do think this comes to the heart of so many problems where like libertarians clash with, I don't know, someone who has my sort of inclination on viewing, like on putting some weight on like externalities and coordination problems. And you'll always, it's the same thing with this, like, telling other men or telling other women that the desire to tell them that their choices are valid, like supersedes the desire to push in the right direction of the social norm, right? And I don't know that it's like limited to sex related stuff. I think it's just like basically anywhere where we think it's a conflating sort of like what's a legally permissible choice with like what should be encouraged.
Yeah, like with fertility, for example, like not telling, like I froze my eggs when I was 30 and I talked to a bunch of women who were like, why are you doing it at such a young age? You have so much time. Why would you do this? And it's like, because it's literally the age that you should be doing this. It was just crazy to me how many people were intent on telling me I didn't need to do this or had no reason to. It was weird.
So again, maybe like what I think is happening in someone's head is, right, like as soon as you tell them, the first thing they think of is, should I be doing this?
Yes.
Am I missing out? And it's like, oh, injections and so much money and going to the doctor, right? It's like really hard. Like I don't want to feel like I am under pressure to do this. And so I'm going to tell Reagan, it
doesn't make sense.
You shouldn't feel pressure to do this. And something like it doesn't even matter if it's like for you, it's a big burden or not. It also like matters more whether it would be a burden for them. Even for them, maybe it's like not relevant at all for some reason. One thing about, kind of not betraying your tribe and being a cooperator is it gets into a pathology where, like, if you're in a group of women and kind of your presumed assumption is that men are trash. You just talk about how men are trash and how the patriarchy ruins everything. And, guys are like violent and they're losers and they're not sensitive and don't contribute anything. And then, right, like it's like one thing to, like if a group of women just agree, okay, we're not going to shave our armpits and manage to coordinate around it, that's pretty good. And then if there's guys in that community, they're probably going to be fine with it. Like I think a lot of guys inherently don't maybe have strong opinions. But then you can keep going. We're not like we're going to, shows our solidarity by, people show their solidarity in spaces by just being like extremely resentful and hateful of the opposite sex. And then again, right, if you try to like push against it, you get called like a simp or a white knight or hope she sees this, bro. Like, I get this all the time. Never say anything positive about women online. If you're a girl, you call the pick me, etc. And right, so this kind of solidarity and loyalty can spiral into pretty bad spaces. You kind of notice because the ratio quickly evaporates. Like if you have a group where, women just like put a bit less effort into grooming, it's not actually going to scare the guys away. But if they're going to say like, oh, misandry is just how we bond here, then it's the first guys are going to chase away like the good guys.
Right.
Maybe some guys are like, I'm willing to like play along.
And that's how you get the archetype of the, evil male feminist and the pick-me hypergamist.
Yeah, like the guy, the average guy who probably like agrees with feminist tenets is probably like the liberal guy who convinced that life is difficult for women. But the selection effect for this sort of guy to also like end up in a space where people talk about how evil the patriarchy is all day, The guy who's just like an actual good male feminist who ends up in a space like that, he just gets married very quickly. He's not gonna stick around. The guy's not gonna like is in that space and he agrees that men are trash, and also he's like on his sixth situationship in that space. Like the adverse selection is off the charts, and all the wrong things.
This is a good example, right, of like the less legible trait of like being a good person and treating women well. Yeah, that's already off the market because someone else has gotten that information and acted on it. And like when you select on some other legible trait, you're getting stuff that's adversely selected on this stuff. Yeah. By the way, Reg, I was
Ramses, right, from Love Is Blind. I thought that's what you were going to bring up.
I was actually going to bring up our.
He was the evil male feminist left in the feminist space on the show.
Right. No, I was thinking of the armpit hair story, which we can cut out if it's too.
I was thinking of that too. So yeah, our friend comes over for a drink and he's like, let me tell you guys about this date I had. And he's saying they were having a great date and then they were about to have sex. And she was like, wait, I need to know what you think about women having armpit hair. And he was like, I guess I'm cool with it. I mean, and anyway, it was like interesting to me that she felt the need to like stop the sexual experience before to warn him essentially that she had this odd grooming particularity.
Which is in contradiction with kind of the psychology you would expect from someone who has done something that actually contravenes what the norm is and is like trying to show confidence. But
yeah, there's a weird thing here where so she could just take her shirt off.
Right.
And then
that's what I
gauge his
thought.
reaction. So again, the story that happened to me, it happened like close to 10 years ago, but I still remember it. I actually remember if I told it on a podcast. But I was on a date with a girl, it's 2015, girl's pretty liberal, she's like a high school teacher. And at the time I was doing stand-up, and she asked me who my top 5 comedians were. I was like, I don't know, Nikki Glaser, Pete Holmes, him, her, whatever. I asked her who hers is, because I did actually watch a lot of comedy at the time. She named some 5 dudes, and I'm like, cool, moved along. And then suddenly she stopped and was like, wait, no, I named 5 men, that's not okay. And I was like, I don't know, like, just the comedy you like who cares, right? I'm sure probably the novelists you read are mostly women. And then she got mad at me for saying that it's okay that she named 5 men as their top comedians. And
you needed to scold her for not being feminist enough in order to prove your feminist bona fides.
You should have spanked her and said, Ali Wong. Ali Wong.
Basically, it's this, right? So I'm not sure, like, who's, like, does she have internalized judgment from other women that she has to prove that she is like a loyal ally to? And then, like, I need to prove it to them, so they prove it to her. So she, like, people. But again, this is sort of, if you don't know what you want, then you replace this in your head. It's replaced with what would be approved of, what is normal, right? Like, what is normal is to say that you should like female comedians. What is normal is, people talking about that, like, of course, it's good for a woman to have armpit hair, which is a bit different from like a guy's actual physical reaction. And I think a lot of it really just has to come with physical experience, just being with people. Just like how to develop knowing what you want and how to do this difficult search problem. There is a limit to how much you can just intellectualize it, just by sitting with yourself, talking to someone, putting together a date meetup, putting together a spreadsheet. There's a lot of things that are in people's heads that basically prevent them from noticing. Whether it's political stories about how you have to be someone, or even just like scientific stories. Like you read some dating guiding book, and they have some like very superficial explanations and this or that cognitive bias that makes people think this or that. You can clean most of the garbage out of your head. Like you're actually out there meeting people of both sexes, seeing how it works. You will learn everything you need to know if you just actually go and do it without being too like stuck in the rut of a particular way of thinking about this. Oh, the guy has to say this and the woman has to do that.
He has to stand on the car side of the sidewalk or whatever. That's one that I heard recently. Oh. If he doesn't stand on the side of the
I do
traffic.
that for you, right?
I want to talk more about the, figuring out what you actually want and also about, how the discourse can sort of suck you in and become very self-defeating. But on one more thing on the solidarity to your own sex thing, makes me think of Louise Perry's The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And, I think on the one hand, her book, talks about dating norms have shifted and they're worse for women now. And all taken together, women are just overall net worse off post-sexual revolution versus pre-sexual revolution. So I know you've talked a lot about dating as a market. If the norms shift for one sex, it'll be compensated for by another sex. Do you think that, that always applies? Or what would you say to the Louise Perry thesis?
So my problem with Louise Perry, and it seems kind of obvious, is that she doesn't care about men at all in her argument. And she says so out loud, right? I met her, I asked her this question at the conference. She's like, yeah, I don't care. And it just seems like a failure of imagination, because a friend of mine just tweeted recently. He said, every time I see some misogynist creed, it just shows me something new and wonderful to love about women, and I love women more. And I immediately like the tweet, and then I check who else liked it, or see who was in the comments, and it was like all the people I would expect. So unlike in a community of men where we bond over how much we just generally like women. And so, right, so and the way to show solidarity to our friend group is to just kind of be very pro-positive sound things. Talk about how women are generally great, especially not ones that you want to sleep with, but just as a general thing, how cool it is that we have, that people come in two sexes and we're so different and can reach each other. So, if we're trying to build solidarity around the complete apathy to the other sex, even if not outright hostility, then it's just not even really great solidarity, because it was just very hard, right? Eventually people want to get married, they want to find someone. And that those things are intention. You're kind of creating this strong temptation for them to defect. And even if you think that all women should just be looking for a guy to settle down with young and have a monogamous marriage, that is also helped by just being generally positive about men. And that includes also, having some compassion and empathy for men, especially young men, having a slightly different, a higher social sexuality, how it is to live as a guy who's really horny, nobody wants to sleep with him, and it's difficult, and you have to navigate it and somehow become, a respectable husband out of it. It doesn't mean you have to give them what they want, but at least if you say, I don't care about your preferences at all, so you're gonna marry one of them? You can't even bring yourself to be interested in what it's like for them.
One thread I was thinking about, and maybe I'll probably need you guys to help me think through this because it's a half-baked idea, but I feel like a bunch of what you were saying around, people just kind of decoupling or being too far away from what's real and what's tangible, like moving away from cashing out utility and preferring instead just sort of intellectualize and kind of play these status games forever, keep delaying and delaying the actual cashing out of what's of value. It seems like a bunch of these things, and including the stuff around hostility towards the other sex, I feel like a bunch of that flows through just having too strong of a fuzzy but strong identity, right? People have these stories about kind of let's say they call themselves a feminist or call themselves any other such things, egalitarian, and then everything that you do is not viewed through the prism of your own interests, but viewed through this additional prism that helps you maintain the identity instead of being in touch with what's true. And I feel like sometimes maybe it's just not even their fault in that unless you kind of are willing to look beneath the hood, you just don't even know what you want because the game is already super acidic and abstract.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think so. This isn't quite the same thing as being too intellectualized. It's almost under-intellectualized, right? You have this identity, it's not very detailed, and so you're kind of always nervous about losing it. I think it's very obvious, for example, with incels, right? So incels, you can have a model of them is you have this identity and at least gets you something, right? It gets you this brotherhood of other men and you can like talk with each other, and you feel all right. At least as long as you're committed to it, your status is secure in that group, and you feel a bit superior to other people who like haven't, are too cowardly to accept the black pill. And there's a certain safety in it, right? So like if you go and try to find a girl and you're rejected, like maybe you're already like on the cliff edge of status, and like one more rejection, you're just like a complete nobody forever. No one talks to you. So like say, okay, well at least I'll cling to that, and it's clearly self-defeating, right? Like if you're an incel, everything you like train yourself to believe is making your life worse in almost all ways, except for being accepted in this particular community. But then there's a lot of other things that we don't think of as being like incel, but they're very much like on that spectrum. You're like being an alpha guy. And so, you like reject a lot of ways of interacting with women. You basically reject respecting or looking up to women. You can't like learn or be inspired by women in any way, because that would go against being an alpha guy. Mm-hmm. Very similar things, on the women's side. And again, it mixes in. People talk about, the girl boss who has those crazy standards, thinks she's like good for a lot of men. And yeah, the problem is if you're locked into some sort of identity where respecting men is bad because you're supposed to just outcompete with men. It's not actually about, being a managing director somewhere. Like plenty of guys would, love to date a woman who's ambitious and skilled enough to like crush it in some male-dominated career. But not if it comes with an identity of, I'm supposed to treat all men as like slightly beneath me. Like, I do things kind of like being stuck in identity, like wanting to preserve your identity. And it's something like if you enter into a serious romantic relationship, that's not good for preserving your identity. Like you become someone else. Just like becoming a husband or a wife is already like someone else. You have to acquire different values. You have to like take pride in different things, let alone becoming a parent or whatever else you were doing. And yeah, it's scary. And especially people's identities come not from, people around you who like really know you well, but from, right, if your identity comes from the sort of like online identity. I'm a member of an online group. I'm like a trad or like a blue sky feminist or something. But those things are really static, right? They're kind of shallow. They don't include like an identity that evolves and has like rituals for transitioning from one life stage to another. And a lot of them, they're all kind of identities for 17-year-olds. Many of those, they don't like really make sense for adults who should be a bit more complex and have different things that they value and contain a bit more than like 5 bullet points of an ideology. And yeah, people can get stuck there. I hope, eventually people find their way out of it. But then like you don't hear about them in the discourse, right? So someone who's stopped doing the thing, someone who is just like going out and meeting people and developing an intuition for who they like, they don't like, very like, especially if it's an embodied intuition, they just like sense they have a good energy with someone. They don't really write about it, and it's hard to write about it. And if you do, then there's no like built-in audience who's gonna upvote you. And so, like, if you just look at the discourse, it selects for people who are only good at the discourse and are bad at doing the opposite of discourse, which is, zeroing down on the one person who's your dream partner and like learning to love them.
Yeah, the identity formation thing was making me think of, and there's going to be more reality TV show references, but an Indian matchmaking woman who was like, she was like, men are always, as soon as she starts the show, every single time she's talking to the camera, she's telling them about how men are always intimidated by her success. And then lo and behold, the guy they set her up with is intimidated by her success in her view. And, it's just as soon as she's rejected, she has some self-superior way to explain that. But yeah, I wanted you to also briefly touch on the idea of like all relationships are transactional, which I think is one of these examples of the discourse sort of poisoning you. And the way Alex Kashuta said it was like, if you're a guy who's out there who believes all relationships are transactional, then, you either have money, in which case you're like, oh, all these women just want me for my money. Or you're looking around at the guys that do have money and you're thinking, oh, all these women are gold diggers. They're so transactional, so there's no point. And you put yourself into dating pools where if you're giving off the vibe that you're viewing every relationship in that way, you're only going to get second dates with people who are actually, looking for transactional relationships.
Yeah, so like I talk a lot about how what really makes a couple work is when you have really complementary skills. And I give example how, with my wife, with Therese, I'm very decisive and optimistic. When random stuff happens, I will always have some course of action I'm willing to suggest. Like I'm never going to be lost or stuck. It might not be the best. She's very conscientious and deliberate. So there are very important things that actually, you shouldn't just like jump and do something. You should have a bias towards, taking your time, being more careful. And, we both are quite open-minded and are willing to trust each other. You kind of intuitively know whose strength is there. Because they're going to frame it as transactional. That, like I'm trading off my decisiveness for my wife's conscientiousness. I'm trading off my extroversion, knowing more people for, my wife's skills in making people feel comfortable or something. I think if you don't like the opposite sex, as a general thing, not like individuals, but just like as a whole, then basically the only way you can conceive of having a relationship is transactional.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If I'm a producer or something, I need like suppliers of raw materials. I don't feel a lot of benevolence to them. I'm like, well, what can I get from them? And then if I'm getting something from them, like on one hand, it's like nice that they're there, so I can trade with them. But like once we're in the trade, right? If it's good for me, it's worse for them. Right? I want to pay less. They want to charge more. Yeah, like some of it is a frame. Because to me, like if I'm doing something that like I'm very good at, it's just like opening jars or inviting friends to a party. Like I feel great. Right? I don't feel like, oh, I'm like paying this cost. Yeah. I'm like, okay, there's this thing. It's maybe like, for me, it's not something like I'm super impressed by it, but like, well, I'm like really glad I get to like show this off and get brownie points for this. Like it feels
totally.
Good.
Yeah, I think it's just a confusion of like your relationship can be positive sum without it being transactional. Those aren't the same thing. Like transactional implies that, the other person's welfare doesn't enter into your calculus at all. And positive sum doesn't imply that. And I think I think a lot of people confuse those two things.
But I think they're slightly separate in that, like, you can have a positive sum exchange where you give up nothing. In fact, like Jacob opens a jar, he feels good, and the person on the other side gives him something, she feels good, and that's positive sum. But I think there's a separate thing which in longer term relationships are just like when you love someone, where the costs and benefits that accrue to them, in some ways you internalize them such that you're not willing to harm or hurt by making I'm sure, we all do that inadvertently and sometimes willingly, but like I think there's a difference between like combining utility functions to some extent and like the nature of the exchange.
Yeah, also combining utility functions. So you could say, okay, like one thing that looks a bit more transactional is, let's say, the classic one, guy goes out and works and the woman like works in the house. She like cooks and spends time with the kids. Okay, is that a transaction? Well, it depends what they value. Like if both of them value having a nice house and like happy kids, then in some sense it's like, okay, like here's like how many hours it takes of labor to get a nice house and happy kids, right? It requires like for someone to make like this much money and for someone to cook this many meals a week and for someone to spend this many hours. And now how do we like efficiently split it between the two of us? And then on the margin, you're like, argue about whose turn it is to do dishes because there's like a bit of tension there. But overall, you're like, well, like I couldn't get all of this for myself. I'm so happy I have, my co-founder here with me. We're doing the same thing. But that requires, both of you to value, like a nice house and happy kids as the main thing you're doing together. Because if not, then, like if the husband's really like want kids, then, well, he doesn't feel like he's going to get in much out of, I don't know, the time the wife spends with them or something. Like, people talk about how one of the most important things when you're looking for a partner is that they have compatible values. The compatible values should mean something like shared utility functions. As a more nerdy way of saying it. Whereas if you're both working towards your utility function, you're happy about that. As opposed to feeling like, oh, she wants paper clips and I want cancer cures. If you may jump into like a very rationalist example. And I guess I'll just make some paper clips that I don't care about just so I can like trade them. If I can get a better trade, I'm gonna like dump her and move on.
Yeah, but like for example, if like Therese is not feeling well tomorrow, right, and or just like kind of in a bad place, like I think you could view your options in two different ways. Like you could view you taking care of her as, well, I'd really like to watch TV, but I guess I'll take care of her because then she'll take care of me. That's kind of a transactional, but still, like I think on a longer term, a fair, positive sum even transaction. But then I think what's closer to reality is like you're not actually happy watching TV knowing that she's in distress, right? When you could be doing something to alleviate it. And I guess having similar utility functions is one thing. And then like over time, you also want the other person's happiness to be like somewhat incorporated into everything else. So if you want to go on vacation, you don't want to do that like by like totally making the other person miserable.
Yes. Like I don't really have a model of what you mean is love, and I don't really have a model of love in the language of utility functions, right? Like I'm just happy I feel like that about my wife. And if somebody doesn't, I'm like, man, I feel really bad for you. It's like so much nicer to live when you like actually care about someone else.
But I think like telling yourself everything's transactional makes it a lot harder to care about other people, basically. Like I think it creates that mental frame that is just not going to put you in the right space to develop those kind of feelings.
I mean, I have some optimism that the sort of people who go on some red pill subreddit and talk about how everything is transactional. Some part of me feels they're like one smile from a cute girl away from like burning down their computer and like just chasing her with a bouquet of roses. Because like I do think the discourse is deranging, and the more you participate in it, the more it kind of makes dating hard for you, and it's generally bad for you. But also, discourse isn't really satisfying. It's the sort of stimulus like junk food. You can get addicted to it, but not because it's great, because it like almost gives you something.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, like being around a person that you're having a crush on is like such a total full body experience that completely takes over your attention and everything. That like if you can get a hint of it, it seems like very hard for some names in a subreddit to compare. It's like, close the screen, bro. Just like close your eyes, walk away from the screen. Like it's not hard to do.
Walk towards the smiling girl and away from the screen.
Now, like, yeah, it is possible to isolate yourself in bubbles. But again, in part, like we don't know when somebody leaves the subreddit. Did they just get bored? Did their like username get logged out because they forgot their password? Or did the cute girl smile on them and they're like happily married? You don't know, right? Like it's selected for the people who are still there. And they're still there, it's like purgatory. Because they're just like stuck there. And the good thing hasn't happened yet.
Right. Yeah, somebody was telling me one of the like big incel leaders of some Reddit forum got married, and the drama and the subculture about that.
Oh, yeah, that's funny. I wrote about it. There's it made the round, this documentary called TFW No GF by Alex Lee Moyer. And it basically followed 4 pretty popular, memers from incel forums. And so she followed them for a couple of years, filming their lives and talking to them and interviewing them, going out with them to the woods to shoot assault rifles. The life of a popular incel. So all 4 of them had girlfriends by the end of filming. Because if you're not just an incel, if you're the sort of incel who's like well known enough and smart enough to make the funniest Wojaks, like that's pretty cool. like not every girl would want that. But like if a girl, likes incel humor, but she's gonna go to the incel forum and pick the top 4 guys. And so yeah, like for guys, really just like find any hierarchy of men and climb it. Like that's kind of work. Like some women would just be into that.
Yeah, I guess it's the difference between like, even if you have an angry personality or like have all these like have some poisonous ideology or you're always fuming about. There is a difference between like going to Reagan's blog and calling her names angrily and the type of person who actually takes at least the time to go write some rebuttal or do something constructive about it, right?
Yeah.
Look, that's what people get wrong about hybristophilia. They like say, "Oh, women write, serial killers." It's like, well, but they don't write guys who talk about how they want to be serial killers. Like actually being a serial killer
Exactly.
is like, right, you need to kill someone, they need to not get caught and kill another person. At the very least, you're high agency. I think, again, Kashuta was talking about this. Women like guys with ambition and skills and competence. And killing lots of people isn't the most productive way to showcase those things, but it definitely shows them. Whereas, if you just go on forum and be like, oh man, wouldn't it be cool to just murder a bunch of people? No one cares about that. That's not
impressing anyone. No one's very
just being not actually.
It's funny because it's sort of like it's just a misunderstanding of like the path dependency. Because what people are doing is they look at the statistics and they go, well, look, it seems to be that people who are comfortable being kind of a dick sometimes, women seem to like them, and then they go, well, given everything else let's hold everything else about my personality constant and just try to be a dick sometimes. And it's like, well, no, that's just a spurious thing. The reason they like it is because it's some honest signal of confidence.
So one of the things you've talked about is like, it's really important to figure out what you're actually looking for. And that's sort of a critical step to improving how you're dating. So how do you think people do that or should do that?
There's a few ways. One is you do get somewhere by just sitting and introspecting. Think of your relationship, think of, your friends, what you like about them, your exes, why did you break up, your parents or anybody else that you know, what did you like or not like about the relationship. So that's almost like step one. If you're at least aware of the idea of, things that are broadly attractive and mimetic desire, you can at least do some discounting. Okay, do I super care about this?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Do I want a really smart partner because everybody talks about smart as one of the first three things they say, or because of something specific? I think it really, you want to tie it to this concept in psychology of the remembering self versus the experiencing self. And so there's a bit of a parallel here, right? You have your imagined future, which is a bit like your remembering self, just projected forward, and then you have your actual projected experience. Right, so the smart mean, look, I just have this specific interest and it's kind of hard to get, and I just need a partner who's going to actually understand this and be willing to talk to me. Like you guys talk about economics and politics and stuff. Versus, or something else. I just want smart because I know they'd be competent in the crisis, but not because I actually need to talk to them about something. And then I think there's a part, which is your deep desires are in some sense related to big holes and gaps and shame that you have. And it's probably a step that's a bit hard for people. And I certainly wasn't doing things like that when I was, when I met Reese. Just in retrospect, I'm realizing how it may have played a role. And again, maybe this is more of the psychoanalysis angle on this. But what's actually something in your life that you're a bit of ashamed of? What's something you've tried to fix for the last decade and you just failed? You just forever not have this. And if you find someone who actually has that thing, that quality that you yourself have failed to acquire, and if you can actually trust them, that maybe they're excited by the opportunity to bring forward this part of themselves, right? They don't hate you for not having this, but they're excited by the fact that they get to do this for you. So I think stuff like kink gets at that, where you're kind of trying to play with the ways, things you're ashamed of, or ways you self-sabotage yourself, or things about you, you feel like you're somehow alienated from other people, you don't want to really talk about it. It's like embarrassing things. That's a place where a lot of your desires are hiding, but it's very tricky to get there. Right? Some people have developed practices very in touch with this.
You don't mean just sexually, right? You mean just in a more I don't know, on a spiritual or
It's like the big thing for me was I realized that I just don't feel safe around so many people who just care about respectability and normalcy.
Mhm.
And I was like very popular when I was young, and I was kind of ostracized from a lot of groups for being the weirdo and just like insisting on my own weird things of how I want things to be. I mean, that's the arrogant nerd. And then, okay, I've learned to get over it, right? I learned, like, I had to like change countries and learn how to get along better in polite society. But then I realized, okay, but it's like in some sense, it's always going to be a mask for me. And I don't want to talk about how, like, I resent normal people for just being normal because I'll never be normal. It's like not really their fault. It's just a kind of dark thing about me. And so, like, when I met Therese, who like, doesn't really strongly feel social pressure and definitely doesn't want to exert it, and still much more in her own world and has her own value judgments and things, as opposed to outsourcing her value judgments to what's acceptable, what's normal around her. And the fact that I also like didn't really care about kind of the mainstream judgments of whatever, right? Like, I really like promiscuous women, and it's just kind of something that's very intuitive to me, and not because like I grew up in some like free love commune. I just like, don't really care what other men think about promiscuous women. And so to her, like, that was exciting. That, yeah, I'm kind of snobbish about mainstream judgment, and to me, it was also important. Yeah, I didn't like really think of it in that way at the time. That, oh, there's this thing that's kind of like always creates this big gap between me and other people in a way that I don't really want to even admit to myself or talk about. Like maybe I had the story of, oh, I finally learned how to be normal in school. But like when I met someone who actually vibed with that, it like immediately felt so great.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about is like, I think a lot of what we've been talking about is especially relevant for people who are, weird in some way. Either people think they're weird or their preferences are just rarely seen. But we've been watching Love is Blind, the TV show, where
Yeah.
it's essentially an arranged marriage. I think of it as essentially a modern attempt at self-arranged marriage. But except for that, the pool is selected for you by TV producers rather than by your, grandma and mom or something. But like, yeah, for people who are going on that show, the feeling is very much that they don't have any really specific preferences. They really do just want like an honest, loyal person who wants to get married and have kids. And anyone who's sort of above their attractiveness bar that meets all those things, they're pretty much ready to commit. Like, do we need some kind of do you think there's like value in thinking about developing some kind of structure to help people who just want that and to not make them feel like weirdos for not wanting to do this like complicated search process?
Well, in some sense, like, dating apps really just work for people like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because on dating apps, the only thing you know about the other person is do they pass your attractiveness bar. Maybe a lot of marriages used to be like that, where it was, but didn't have a lot of selection. So if like you're gonna marry someone who like lives in your block and goes to your church, and in some sense it's basically selected by all of your families who like chose to move to the block, and so you may as well just like accept basically. Like it's not like quite the mimetic desire of the people around you, but like, well, that's what you're gonna get, so you may as well like it. But yeah, again, a lot of those marriages they were okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I do think by default it is just better to live with someone that you even like someone get along with. Like we are made to, we're a sexual species. we want this stuff. I think you can get something much better if you, and in something like there's been a lot of increased expectations of marriage, right? Like it's no longer.
And you live longer too, so like the marriages go on longer.
Yeah, people talk about how we invented romantic marriage, right? It's not just about someone who the guy provides protection and money, and the woman like gives kids to work in the fields, and that works. But it needs to be, my best friend and someone who like emotionally resonates with me, and someone who I'm gonna be like sharing all the hobbies and traveling together and all that stuff. Like, okay, well, expectations have gone up. And in some sense, you also have more selection power. Right? You're not just limited to a very small pool. So you could get all of that thing.
Mm-hmm.
But the way, like I called it, you need to do the work of 10 grandmas. Right? Like 2 grandmas were enough to get you like an okay partner for like a medium expectation marriage. To get a great partner for a high expectation marriage, you need 10 grandmas. And again, you might decide you don't want that, right? You want, right? So, yeah, like the dating apps or TV show producers, they can do the work of 1 grandma,
Mm-hmm.
which is find someone who's, I don't know, your rough socioeconomic class and it looks match. It's not a lot, but it's something.
Yeah, I think the interesting question is like how much better can relationships actually be? And yeah, my intuition is that they can be a lot better, but I think if you don't have that intuition for whatever reason, then you're going to miss sort of the, you know, everyone gets a mediocre marriage system.
Yes, I think it goes back to Tolstoy, which is you actually have no idea how good relationships can get. Like you know about people divorcing,
Mm-hmm.
and you might hear about people who are unhappy. And then there's this giant pool of people who are married, and you have no idea if they're like, oh, kind of okay with each other, or like, oh my, I can't believe what a blessing it is to wake up in this relationship every day.
Based on what we said earlier, there's a reason you're unlikely to hear from that cohort that's happy as well, right?
Yeah. And in media, right? Like, no one's going to make movies about the 99th percentile married couple who are just like so happy together. There's no conflict, there's no interest. And, if you're not lucky to have some among your best friends or your parents, then you kind of have no idea. Like, that's the real unexplored territory, is the good right tail of relationships.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a difference between, so let's say on the one hand, our expectations for what partners should fulfill has gone through the roof, right? And yes, we do have more selection power, but it seems like the problem is we don't have the search tools we have are pretty bad for us to select really well, especially on those less legible things. So it might be very possible to have actually a good long-term relationship over time, right? But that doesn't look like the exalted feeling one should feel when they meet someone and feel like they're soulmates with, because that means the search function has led you straight to the optimal match, and that's often what's not happening. But that doesn't mean that your relationship is doomed.
Right. I mean, people do. They have a sense of like the top of the funnel. And your first 2 months with someone, people do know that in the first 2 months, sometimes you just kind of like someone a little bit, and sometimes you have this insane all-consuming crush. Man, it's very, very different from what makes a okay 50-year marriage or an incredible 50-year marriage. And also part of it is, right, like, if I'm going to have an incredible 50-year marriage, like, I'll only know about this 50 years from now. And it will probably almost always, it's going to be very hard to generalize. Maybe part of it is, so we do have, looking around at all of humanity, we have some evidence that, okay, the majority of people can be in an okay marriage. Okay, how many people could be in like an incredibly good marriage? There's no guarantee that actually everyone is capable of it. Maybe it's very specific people. Maybe people who, really the main thing they care about is domestic bliss. Like, it's probably anti-correlated with having other ambitions, because when you read biographies of successful people, it's probably not like the entrepreneurs and revolutionaries and explorers who had the best marriages. Right? It's like obvious, right? If you look so happy at home, why are you like trying to get to the South Pole on a dog sled?
That's like the people who at my old workplace were like dying to come back to work after the pandemic. I was like, wow, these guys must really hate their wives, huh? Like they can't wait to get out of the house. Yeah, no, I think like in terms of can everybody have it, this came up with a friend of mine recently where, we were talking about the style of post that is a woman posting something really nice that her boyfriend did, followed by "Don't settle, ladies, he's out there," or whatever. And it's like, yeah, I don't know. What do you think of that? What do you think that type of tweet is signaling?
Well, it's signaling that she's like so cool that she deserves it.
Mm-hmm. But also that she's in solidarity with her single sisters at the same time.
Yeah, no, because you definitely don't want to be a tall poppy and kind of just brag. And so you're always going to cloak it in, oh, like all of you can also go get it, right? Maybe I was just lucky that I met the guy. Like if she was honest, she'd talk about, okay, why, like, what does she do? What does she bring to the relationship that makes her boyfriend so excited? Do super nice things for her. It's probably not, right? Like I wrote about it, but just being hot and standing there isn't a love language. That's not true.
Just
you know?
what? Say that again?
Like just being hot is not actually a love language. You know, just being hot gets a guy to bring you flowers like 1 week into knowing you. But he's been your boyfriend for a year and he's going out of his way to do good things for you. It's probably because he cherishes other things about you other than you just being hot and doing nothing else. This is part of it. Is it's kind of fun. Like the only two things you're allowed to say about, who's going to make it is either we're all going to make it or, only the 5% Chads and they're like little harems of
Right.
Stacys. It's like really weird to go and say, well, I don't know, 60% of us are going to make it and 40% of us are going to die alone.
Mm-hmm.
If you're at the border, you should really work on it. And again, I'm not saying this is true.
You wrote something around how no figment of society is actually sex positive, right? That you were just kind of going through different groups, I think, and saying, well, this ideology is also sex negative. Yeah, why? Like, go through that and then tell me why you think that, or why you think that's the case.
Well, I mean, if you just go over it, then you just kind of notice. You just start with politics, right? So you're conservative or you're kind of sex negative. You're talking about it's dangerous, it's corrupting, premarital teen pregnancy, whatever. If you're progressive, maybe you want some sort of like display of sexual identity. You're positive on that. I'm a queer, submissive, this, that, but not like actual sex, which is it's biological and there's power involved and it might be exploitative or something. Again, anything having to do with consumerism or capitalism, right? Like your job wants you working, not flirting with people. Car companies trying to sell you sex appeal, but they want you buying cars, not like actually having sex with someone in the back seat, of your cheap pickup truck. Whatever, like politicians, media, people made the point that in Marvel movies, everyone's hot but no one's horny. And I think the reason for this is memetic competition in the very direct Richard Dawkins sense, where any other big area of society is some sort of egregore, some sort of collection of ideas that demand your attention, whether it's a political movement, whether it's a dedication to working or to pursuing some other goal. And that's just in direct competition with you putting your attention and energy into, right, like thinking about the sort of people you want to date and then going out there and dating them and investing in the relationship. And so we've had the sexual revolution, and then it became fashionable to wear the cloak of sex positivity and be non-judgmental. But ultimately, culture is made up of a lot of things that compete with each other for your attention. And they also compete with you saying fuck you to all of them because you're just focused on one person. And that really involves kind of stepping away from society and culture and not letting them in.
I guess one way to frame it, which there's some tension there, but like one way to frame it would be culture is about kind of, it's a social engineering tool to some extent push back or restrain your, impulses or selfish desires so you can like live better with others, right? And coordinate and live in a social context. But now, and I'm wondering, so all these other, the idea space and everything else that's trying to compete for your attention, they don't really have your actual, experiential interest at heart. They have your interest at heart insofar as it captures your attention. But why do you think that, doesn't being a happy person have positive externalities? Why isn't there a cultural force that's making use of that do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, positive externalities. So Like, I just randomly root for people to end up in happy relationships. Like, it makes me happy to hear about it. Because, and probably for you as well. But, well, we're people who just like other people. We're not memes who are just trying to propagate. And so it's almost, like, in general, people do, I think, individually root for each other or support each other. You know, when like a cute couple walks down the street holding hands, most people aren't scowling at them, right? Most people are going to be generally happy. But when you get to the level of, you know, the ideas that kind of like shape culture at large, or politics or anything like that, that's like, those ideas don't care about positive externalities. They're just in this, you know, bloodthirsty mimetic competition with each other. And so, like, the more local you get, the more people, I think, are happy, right? Like,
Right.
people are happy at weddings. People are happy to go to weddings. But, you know, when you buy a tabloid, you want to hear about how, you know, Brad Pitt divorced whoever it is he's divorcing this year, as opposed to how they just spent another uneventful year of being happy together. Because he's
you're
not
right.
someone you know, he's just a symbol.
I also think that this does have something to do with the right tail relationship outcomes, where I think that especially if you know you are in a mediocre marriage, that seems to be good, and most other people that you are around seem to be also in those. Like you also don't necessarily think there's that much higher of a bit, like I don't know. I don't think everybody believes, whether it's a cope because they don't want to believe that they're missing out on something or whatever. I think, you know, some people do scowl at people holding hands walking down the street and they're like, oh, they're going to hate each other in 6 months. I've heard people say stuff like that. But yes, I agree with you. People who are happy themselves generally are more, find it easier to be happy for others.
There's one exception to this, which it's actually just an interesting observation. I wanted to tell you about this yesterday, which is, you know, the thing where like you are, you know, let's say you have a friend or a loved one and they are with someone who you believe either because they've had some like bad, you know, abusive or just like bad experience with that person before, or because you just have judged being close to this person that this partner they've chosen is not good for them. And I was envisioning this, like, you know, scene where the person tells you about, oh, I got engaged to her, right? And the reflexive reaction that most of us can muster is not one of like full excitement in a way that I think may be obvious to the other person. And I was thinking what's going on underneath there. And I think there is I actually think that might come actually from a good place of saying, of being like, I don't want to be inauthentic and kind of, it makes me look bad if I'm like sharing in this joy and then after a while you guys break up, you know, that like also reflects poorly on me, but also there's some, you know, concern or genuine concern for the other person. But anyway, I don't think it's like tangential to our discussion, but I was like,
No, but
that's
it's not that,
interesting.
like, your relationship with someone is in some sense everybody else's business. Like, at least people who know you are very involved with this. Again, even though, right, maybe like not that involved. To me, like, what is marriage? Marriage is you're signaling to people around you that you're not like putting your chips on the table, that we're going to be committed to each other. But there's a deal here. The deal here is that everyone around you is going to support you and kind of like force you to be together, right? Like, everyone around you is going to, like, you know, really think you're an asshole if you cheat on the person that they like paid $100 to go to your wedding. Rather, like,
no, that's exactly right. So we like the marriage is about increasing barriers to exit, and we are the barriers to exit by like being the social group that will, you know, support them but also tell them to stay together. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, like it makes sense for everyone around you to be kind of interested in your business. I think people just a bit over-index on that. Like, when you yourself are choosing who to marry, I think most people like, take too much into account what everyone around them thinks, especially when everyone around them isn't like actually people they interact with, but some sort of societal judgment that's more remote. Like, you need to like, push it a bit further away when you're actually with someone. You know, like they'll still come and judge you. Like, you're not going to be alone on an island. But like, you know, give the two of you some space away from. Like,
yeah, I mean, I think that one somewhat changes depending how young the person is. Like, I think, if you're somebody who does want to get married young because you want to have 6 kids or something, you probably should listen. You should probably make sure your family thinks you've chosen someone appropriate if you're, getting married at 22. One other thing that I wanted to touch on that we had talked about, that you've talked about before, is tell us your take on Barbie, the Barbie movie.
Yeah, so I think there's two big themes in the Barbie movie. Both of them, for some reason, everybody missed them, I guess because it's a kids' movie. The first one is actually related to a lot of things you've talked about, is like, what are men and women doing with each other when we don't need each other for protection and procreation, for just like economic survival? Because in Barbie they don't even have genitals. You say, well, like, men don't need marriage for sex and women don't need marriage for economic survival. And so what are you actually doing together? And so, as Barbie is kind of growing up from being a child to discover, her and Ken, like, what do they actually have to offer each other? Something more kind of spiritual, more higher. But really, Barbie is a movie about how, like, women need to get out of the longhouse. The longhouse is really the tyranny of women imposed on other women. And so you have the famous speech in Barbie. I can find the link to quote it, but I think probably most people know it. How there's all those impossible, contradictory things that are expected of women. They need to take charge and do things, but also they need to be soft and agreeable. None of the men in the movie demand any of this of the Barbies. The only thing any man ever asks of any Barbie in the movie is bring me a brewski and, I'm going to sing you a song on my guitar. Like, literally smile and bring me a beer, and, like, even fat Barbies invited. Like, you don't even have to be skinny or successful or anything. And then the Barbies themselves, you're not allowed to have flat feet. You're not allowed to have cellulite. You're not allowed to think of death. Like, the Barbies themselves are imposing this like super strict tyrannical conformism on each other, and they call it the patriarchy. Like, I was riffing on that a little bit. Again, it is like a bit of a kids movie, but a kids movie in the sense of, Barbie Land is the world of children, where as a child you are in, like, your house is the longhouse. You have pretty strict norms, and some of them might feel like they're contradictory as you're growing up, and those norms are probably imposed by a woman or by women. And then to actually become an adult, like someone who has genitals, like the final scene of the movie is Barbie's hitting puberty. You need to get away from that. Like, you don't need to come back and burn it down and destroy it, but you need to find your space from it. And yeah, like, calling this tyranny of norms the patriarchy seems like a very simplistic trick that the longhouse pulls. And the longhouse always is, basically, it's more constraining of women than of men. Like, men do have a bit more freedom to say, look, I don't care what like the council of women think about me. I'm going to do my own thing. For women, it's harder. Men are always kind of by default, they're outside. And you can say, well, the longhouse protects, it's like our protection from the evil men out there. But there's no men in Barbie at all. Ken is basically a boy. He kind of has no agency, just like follows along, and stuff he gets excited about is like a 4-year-old. Yeah.
But no, I mean, obviously this is the most shallow version of what you're saying, but like, when I've seen people tweet out, this is what it costs to keep yourself up as a woman in New York City, and it's like $400 a month of hair appointments and nail appointments and whatever other things. And it's like, there's no guys that are demanding these things, or very, very, very few. And you can literally just stop at any moment and just see what happens. If nobody wants to date you anymore, maybe you've done too little in terms of grooming, but otherwise you're probably doing fine.
This is where maybe I disagree with the framing of like collective action problem, because actually this is not an actual problem. Like, each individual is pretty capable of opting out of this. And it's like it's not such that they're facing an incentive scheme that they have to respond to, right? So like on some level, like maybe we should blame the people who actually like get work done less and people who complain about it more.
Well, I think like, in some sense the promise of the longhouse is there are dangerous men out there, and if you break our rules and you like, go out to the wilderness and you get hurt, then like you can't go back to us and complain. You're like, well, you brought this on yourself, right? We told you, dress like this, find your own job, do this thing. And kind of, in some sense, like, okay, are you willing to take the risk and think that you will figure out your own path? Like Barbie actually does. I think maybe in part like she like goes out and like meets like actual men for the first time, and they're like kind of goofy. They're not that dangerous, like the Will Ferrell character. And she's like, okay, I can like probably deal with it. I actually, I'm an adult. I'll figure it out. I don't need the council of Barbies standing guard around me. That's how I saw the movie, but also I was the only adult man in the theater where I saw it.
No, I think that's a good take. I like it. I also was thinking back to like the longhouse and what your community is like. Yeah, it is true that in a lot of communities that I've seen from the outside, women are always complaining about men and vice versa. But in my actual group of female friends who have mostly just had various relationships back to back or with limited time in between, they're all like they all love men. I don't know. So I guess I don't.
So I think this is the sort of thing that people really cluster on, like women who hate men,
right?
Or at least who adopt this persona of hating men. They really hang out together, and vice versa, and the same for men. And this is something that people really underestimate how different communities are and how much people cluster on those invisible norms. And so when I hear like people say, "Oh, man, I can't believe like all guys are like this. Or all guys are like fuck ups in this way." And like, no, you're just like in the fuck up dating market. Like literally, at the next bar over, there sits like a group of guys who superficially look exactly the same. And you have this. I mean, I have like my friends who occasionally, like my best friend was invited to a bachelorette party, and she went, and she was just shocked that like half of what the women talked about for the entire weekend was how much men suck.
Mm-hmm.
And she has female friends. She's like has her life and her stuff. And she was like, completely unaware of this. The same way, probably for a lot of people who maybe live in a place like New York City, like 30% of their city voted for Trump. They don't know who those people are.
Right.
There could be the neighbor, there could be the person on the street, but it's completely invisible because people so self-select into groups that filter on that.
Yeah, I also think there's a big difference between like a group of women or a group of men complaining about their partners in like a lighthearted way and identifying common patterns that the other people might have also had with their partners that tend to fall along gendered lines versus complaining about the other sex as like in general, because the former I think is like something we've always had, and it's consistent with thinking these are all positive sum relationships and everybody's trying to do their best. It's just like a way of people of the same gender blowing off a little steam about typical ways that people can misunderstand each other in relationships.
Yeah. So like we were talking about how the right tail is invisible. Mm-hmm. And I think in part, right, like probably if everyone around you just has like a 6 out of 10 marriage, that's probably your ceiling. And in part because, right, and I was talking about how like people say, oh, in the olden times, right, comedians would go on stage and do those jokes like, take my wife. No, seriously, take her. Like, well, like it kind of makes sense because people weren't match made that well, and a lot of people's marriages were kind of mediocre but tolerable, better than nothing. And then you would show solidarity with your bros or your sisters by talking about, in all the ways that your marriage isn't 10 out of 10 and how it's your spouse's fault. But like, if you try to go for like a really great marriage in a situation like that, you'll face like immense social pressure to not have a perfect marriage because like, what about you, some kind of weirdo? You don't have anything to complain about your wife, like or
totally.
You don't trust us enough to be vulnerable. It's very suspicious. So yeah, maybe the deal with perfect marriages, they all like hang out somewhere by themselves.
No, they just never tell anyone. They never, ever, ever tell anyone about how good their marriage is. Because
How to find them and how to be friends with them. So what do you guys think? Where are you gonna end up?
oh, definitely a 10 out of 10. I mean, we're very egotistical about our relationship.
I think that's a good thing. That's a good identity to cultivate, is like, oh, our relationship is awesome, because you want to keep it awesome, right?
Okay, do you feel like you have good role models, or you're like, no, everybody else is retarded, we're gonna figure out for ourselves because we're like thoughtful and original?
I think that there's good role models, and definitely have a couple of friends who I know have, 9 or 10 out of 10 relationships. You can just tell. So, I mean, it's good to see that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very much rooting for everyone I know to have an awesome relationship, in part to, to like inspire me. Like, I do think this is the sort of thing that just like rubs off.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people who come over to our place when we host brunches, and they say, their favorite thing is, that maybe Chris and I are like more promising, than like other people they know, and they just want to kind of absorb the white pill.
Totally.
It's like stands that you can like really be happy together.
Totally. And I mean, even if you're in a relationship, I do think it's like you should pay attention to what you're seeing around you, and it should make you, if you're seeing that a lot of people around you are in better relationships, maybe you didn't find the best relationship, or maybe you should change and find strategies to improve the current relationship and like put real effort into it.
Yeah, I think like once you get married, your friends who aren't happy for you just tend to drop off. In general, you kind of notice there's not like a lot of socialization between like married people, especially married people with kids, and people who aren't. Like, I'm kind of going out of my way because not a lot of my friends my age are married, or at least people I've made friends with when I just came to New York 10 years ago. But people who aren't happy to be around you specifically as a couple or as a family, it's kind of like naturally they'll find their way somewhere else. And that's actually not how I met you. I met Reagan through a poker game, through a shared friend.
Right.
But I do just, love being a social group tourist. Anybody who I'm mutuals with on Twitter, which maybe like doesn't tell you that much about what sort of person they are, where they live, and I've like flown around the world just meeting online friends. And some of them live in a village somewhere, and some of them live in Paris, and most of them live in the Bay. But yeah, no, if people invite me somewhere, I'll probably show up. If you like my tweets, then you'll probably like me in person.
I think that's a good, your Twitter profile, I would say, is also an accurate representation of you as a hang.
It's related to dating. If you are actually just yourself on Twitter instead of adopting some persona, there's very few places where somebody who's from outside your immediate circles can have such a real insight into who you are as a person as they could, if you are somewhat prolific Twitter poster and are being honest, like tweeting from a real place. And so if you're doing that, Twitter could be your best dating app, because Twitter actually provides a lot of context about who you are, what you value, what sort of people you get along with, what your struggles are. People don't really think of it that way, because it's not like, it doesn't say dating on the tin. That's the good thing. You don't want to lead with the fact that you're single and desperate. You want to lead with, here's who I actually am. And then, right, like I talked about having social circles that do some selection, but it's also nice to have some serendipity. So I didn't meet Therese through rationalists, even though she has this sort of natural inclination to be a very good fit for this group. And so, yeah, you want to kind of know what you're looking for, but then, leave room for serendipity, whether it's Twitter or whether it's flying to random countries for events.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I did meet you, Vaish, through my own meetup group, so that did work out for me. But yeah, like you're saying, Twitter is sort of like the less desperate version of the Date Me Doc. It takes more constant upkeep, but assuming you also find it fun to tweet, that makes sense. Anyway, is there anything else you wanted to touch on before we wrap it up?
No, I had a great time. And yeah, it's really nice to talk about, in the context of you guys getting married soon.
Yeah, no, we're excited. We're just 2 months away from leaving for our India wedding, and then we're planning the Canadian stuff as well. So I'm now figuring out my mom and grandma's Indian outfits this weekend, which I'm excited about.
Okay.
We've definitely invited you to the Canadian wedding, but if you want to fly over and explore a different culture, you're welcome. You're welcome to India too.
Okay, I might. I'll ask Therese. Yeah, we had a California wedding and a party on my parents' roof in Israel. So it wasn't a really big affair in Israel, but yeah, I also kind of got married in two countries.
Yeah, I mean, it's more planning, but I'm excited. There's moments where we're like, did we need to plan so many events? But mostly I'm getting excited. And honestly, his parents did like everything for us, so we didn't have to do all that much. Okay, so Jacob is writing his dating book in blog posts on Second Person on Substack, so follow him there. He also has still put a num on it is.
Yeah, it's kind of put on hiatus. So
On hiatus.
secondperson.dating or just Yashkaf on Twitter.
Yeah. And there's a lot of the stuff we covered. He goes into with deeper insights, more examples, and a lot of good jokes. One of the ones that I remember, I love the PP hacking. I don't know why that made me laugh so much. So yeah, he takes the time to craft some one-liners in there. So check it out. Anyway, thanks again for joining us, Jacob. It's secondperson.dating and Yashkaf on Twitter.
Thanks, Jacob. It's fun talking.
Thank you, guys. Always a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.